Okay, I'm sorry, I've just got a message on my screen, so I'm just going to remove that now. So agriculture is the biggest source of emissions of ammonia, accounting for around 88% of ammonia from the sector. Ammonia is a gas of concern to us because it reacts in the atmosphere with other chemicals to produce fine particulate matter, and that's harmful to cardiovascular and respiratory disease. And we're expecting to have new targets to reduce concentrations of particulate matter and the exposure of populations to it, resulting from the Environment Act, which has just been come into force. So the other impact of ammonia is that it results in excessive nitrogen in habitats, and so it's the main source of harmful nitrogen deposition. What that does is it reduces biodiversity, and it also has the potential to acidify soil. Ammonia also has direct toxic effects on some habitats. Can we move to the next slide? Thank you. And so you can see that nitrogen deposition is a big concern. Local sources account for around 25% of total nitrogen deposition, and so this is why farming and ammonia from farming has such a big impact, because it tends to be near our most sensitive and most important ecosystems. Nitrogen deposition, it results in it changes biodiversity, and it can reduce ecosystem functions such as carbon sequestration and flood mitigation even, so the retention of water and nutrients in particular environments. The recovery of these sensitive sites takes decades, even when the pollution from nitrogen is removed, because although they're no longer receiving ammonia, it's very difficult to lose the nitrogen from the system. Some will leach out eventually, and of course that can contaminate watercourses, but basically it ends up in the vegetation. So around 90% of English SSSIs, and I must say, by the way, that being from DEFRA, and I know this is a British association, but being from DEFRA, the policy that I'm referring to relates to England only, although I'll come on to the targets we have to reduce ammonia emissions, which do bite at UK level. So the SSSIs receive nitrogen at levels at risk biodiversity loss for at least one feature. And we've got the 25-year environment plan sets out targets to reduce the impact on those habitats by restoring 70% of area, 75% by area of those habitats to favourable conditions. So ammonia really threatens that target. And unfortunately, and this is a slightly unexplained effect at the moment, the Clean Air Strategy commits to reducing nitrogen deposition on sensitive protected habitats by 17% by 2030. And this is from 2016 levels. And this unfortunately appears to have increased since 2016. And we don't really understand this, because can we move on to the next slide? Thank you. Thanks. As you can see, this is the ammonia emissions, the national ammonia emissions since 2005. And you can see that actually since 2016, levels of ammonia actually haven't changed very much. And also NOx emissions, which is the other thing that contributes to nitrogen deposition, have also reduced. So this is a surprising effect, and it's probably to do with, it's either a blip in the system, we may have got the sampling wrong, or it could be something to do with atmospheric chemistry and essentially ammonia remaining in the atmosphere for longer. So, you can see on this map that we have legally binding targets that are set to reduce ammonia emissions. We're required to reduce emissions from 2005 levels by 8% by 2020 and 16% by 2030. And you can see there the projected emissions, which is the green line, and the 2020 target is the yellow dot. We're due to reach that target by 19 kilotons. We'll get the results for that in early 2022. Actually, I think 2020 was an unusual year, and we're hoping that the emissions actually won't be quite as bad, because it looks as though fertilizer use was down a little bit. So we'll just have to see whether that target is breached in the end, but it's looking likely. And then for 2030, unless further action is taken, it looks as though we're set to breach the target by 48 kilotons. And just to, can we move on to the next slide, please? I wanted to give an idea of where those the sources of agricultural emissions. So you can see that cattle is responsible for 48% of ammonia emissions from agriculture, and that's pretty equally divided between beef and sheep. If you look at the pie chart on the left, livestock housing is the biggest source, and that's because there's lots of hard surfaces, which means that the main cause of ammonia is urine and dung sort of interacting together, and it volatilizes, and it can also volatilize from slurry stores and during the spreading of slurry in particular, but also manure to land. Can we move to the next slide, please? And so these are the things, this is a list of things that farmers can do to reduce emissions. It's not exhaustive, and I think that Tom will probably talk in more detail about some of them. You can see on the right-hand side there, you've got pictures of 3 different low emission spreading methods. We've got shallow injection at the top, and then that can reduce emissions from spreading by up to sort of 70%, 80% maybe. And the middle one shows a trailing shoe, although it's done on bare soil. That can also be applied on grass systems. That can reduce emissions relative to splash plate spreading by around 60%. And then at the bottom, what we refer to as a trailing hose, but I think it's also called a dribble bar, and that can be applied in crops and reduces emissions by around 30%. And then we have 2 other mitigation measures shown there. We have a rigid store cover on a tank, and then also a floating cover. And these are methods that can not only reduce ammonia loss, but also potentially save farmers money on fertiliser inputs. So when these measures are combined together, covering the slurry and then applying it in a way that reduces emissions, actually quite significant savings are possible. But of course, it does mean that farmers need to have a way to store slurry. You can see there's other methods, some of which are cost saving potentially. So lower protein diets could be if applied correctly, although there are some risks in that in terms of animal health, so it needs to be dealt with carefully. Incorporation of solid manure to land as soon as possible. And then the use of things like urease inhibitors or use of ammonium nitrate fertilizers in preference to urea, because urea actually has particularly strong high ammonia emissions. And you can see some of the housing measures such as floor scraping, groove floors, and acid scrubbers, which are typically used on more intensive systems such as poultry in other countries in particular, and pigs. Those tend to be more expensive measures and perhaps save a little less money for the farmer, but they're quite effective for improving animal health in some cases. Can we move to the next slide, please? And so the Clean Air Strategy set out that we'd require and support farmers to reduce emissions, and I'll explain what we've done to provide support. There's some guidance available on the Code of Good Agricultural Practice, which sets out the practices that can reduce emissions, and I showed some on the previous slide. I'm not going to play that YouTube link, but if the slides are circulated, you'll be able to see it. It just sets out at very high level some of the things that can be done to reduce emissions. There's also advice and practical support through the Catchment Sensitive Farming Programme, which has provided some demonstration events, and there's a link there to the 10 case studies they've produced, some of which are relevant to the dairy sector. Next slide, please. We also said that we would introduce regulation, and so we consulted last year on reducing emissions from urea fertilisers, and we're expecting a government announcement on that probably early in the new year. And then we said we would consult on other measures to introduce low emission spreading by 2025 and to cover slurry and digestate stores and rapidly incorporate manure. We also said that we would bring in measures to extend environmental permitting regulations to dairy and intensive beef sectors by 2025. And Tom will update you on some of the work that's being done to underpin that development, that regulation. And that mandatory standards for new livestock housing would also be introduced. And again, this will focus very much on the best available techniques that can be produced. So can we go to the next slide, please? So in terms of progress, we've made various streams of funding available. some of which is currently available, some of which is historic. So we funded some slurry covers. We've got some really interesting feedback from people who've been involved in that scheme. And so we understand much more about the practicality of that and the market constraints. So that's really helpful in developing the policy that we'll be consulting on hopefully early next year. The Farm Productivity Scheme has offered equipment such as slurry robots, acidification and slurry spreading. And the Farm Equipment and Technology Fund is actually currently open, and that also contains certain items of support for slurry management, including low emission spreading equipment. The Countryside Stewardship Scheme offers slurry covers, low emission flooring, slurry scrapers and shelter belts. And that's actually more widely available than it has been in the past. So if you're interested in looking into that, then have a look and see what's on offer. I don't know if they're currently open for applications, but we anticipate that there should be more funding through that route. And then on regulation, I've mentioned these things already, other than to say that the Nutrient Management Expert Group, which is going to provide recommendations on how we support and regulate to improve manure and slurry management, will make recommendations in spring next year. So we'll be looking at that as we make regulation. Can we go to the next page, please? So in terms of what's planned, we anticipate that the catchment sensitive farming programme will increase in its scale and it will cover pretty much nationally within the next 3 years. So there should be more support available to farmers. And catchment sensitive farming officers can help to give advice on farm, but also I think to signpost things like grants. There's the Sustainable Farm Incentive, and the pilot included some measures to help with nutrient management. I believe there's going to be an announcement today on what the future scheme will look like as well. The Farm Transformation Fund, which is the Countryside Productivity Large Grant Scheme, is due to also really make some announcements in the near future, I think. And in future, it will fund more on slurry. So at the moment, there is a slurry investment scheme, which was announced in the Agricultural Transition Plan, that started to deliver already through the Farm Investment Fund that's currently open. But there's some co-design work going on, which will look much more thoroughly at how it will design a new grant scheme, but I say new grant scheme, it's possibly going to be delivered through one of the existing mechanisms. But also it will look at the nutrient management system as a whole to see what DEFRA can do to really support investment. And we hope to get some conclusions from that by around autumn next year, but I'm sure it will be an ongoing programme for a number of years yet. Can we go to the next slide, please? And so we consulted last year on urea regulations. There's a reminder up there of the 3 options we consulted on. And then the reason that we haven't yet issued a government response is because we've been looking at the measures, we've been reanalysing based on the information that came back through the consultation. So an industry consortium put forward a proposal to implement an approach through farm assurance, which involves the use of urease inhibitors with urea fertilisers from the 1st of April, and then untreated urea during the period that would have been restricted in option 3. We've looked very closely at those proposals, and as I say, there should be a government response in the new year. I'm not at liberty to say what will be in that yet. We're hopefully consulting on measures to reduce emissions from manure, slurry and digestate. I had hoped when I accepted the offer to speak that I would be able to tell you exactly what was going to be in that consultation, and I'm afraid I'm not. But it will cover, we anticipate it will be covers, low emission spreaders and rapid incorporation of manure. At the moment, I can't say exactly what that's going to look like because I don't know. Environmental permitting, we aren't starting the policy development on that until probably April or perhaps slightly later next year, but Tom's doing some work which he'll talk about, and the mandatory standards will follow. So I think moving on to Tom now. Can we have the next slide, please?
Thank you. Thanks, Kate. Hello, everybody. My name's Tom Judd and I work in the Environment Agency's agriculture team, and I'm working with Peter and John and others on today's call as part of an industry group to collate appropriate measures and techniques that could help underpin a future environmental permitting approach. So what I was going to do today is just give a short overview of what we've been doing, and then if there are any questions, answer those at the end. The first thing to note is just a short introduction to environmental permitting. The environmental permitting regulations were introduced back in 2008 and consolidate many separate pieces of legislation that had evolved and over 20-30 years, and all of those regimes were seeking to protect different environmental media, but that unfortunately resulted in quite heavy administrative burdens and quite a bit of overlap for operators and farmers, where there were multiple types of license and permit, with a bit of a lack of clarity. So the environmental permitting program, the framework, aimed to reduce that red tape burden, both for the industry and also for the regulators, by providing that single framework without compromising the environmental and health standards. The Environment Agency regulates a wide range of sectors through environmental permitting, which range from typical on-farm waste activities right through to very large industrial processes such as power stations, etc. Could I have the next slide, please? The environmental permitting regulations are flexible. It's quite a flexible framework, and is risk-based as well. So lower risk activities can benefit from a light touch approach, whereas more complex and higher risk activities require more involved permits with bespoke conditions and bespoke requirements. So it's a flexible framework. And when we sat down with the industry group at the start of this process, we were embarking on to seek a regulatory approach that was integrated. So not only in terms of the emissions from the industry and the emissions that we need to address, being ammonia being the primary policy driver for this, but also that was integrated with the other regulatory initiatives that are under development at the moment, and Kate touched on those in her slide pack. We're keen for any approach to be scalable and appropriate to the size of the farm, and proportionate and flexible because of the wide diversity within the dairy sector in terms of husbandry approaches and buildings and infrastructures that are employed. We need to ensure that the costs of the regulatory requirements do not exceed the benefits, and where possible they promote innovation, not only around ammonia reductions and reducing emissions, but also through improving productivity and efficiencies as well. The other aim is to bring the different regulatory requirements for the dairy and beef sector into a single place. To try and consolidate rather than duplicate or add regulatory requirements. Next slide, please. This slide shows an overarching timeline for the dairy and beef permitting project, and as Kate has said, the Clean Air Strategy sets out to introduce permitting by 2025. We are currently in the BAT development phase, so at the left-hand side of the flowchart, and we have established two technical working groups that we're working closely with, one focusing on nutrition and genetics, and the other looking at housing, yard areas, storage and spreading opportunities. And obviously Kate has just explained many of those techniques in her session. We're in the technical working group is the evidence collation phase, where we're looking at the opportunities and the availability of a range of techniques, and also the costs of those techniques and the applicability of those techniques to the English industry. And we'll be using that evidence to help inform the policy development that, as Kate has said, was due to start later in 2022. yeah, we also recognise that the timescales for introducing permitting are very soon, but and that has been a key issue that's been flagged up through the dialogue with the industry group. And permitting is an approach whereby it enables lead-in times and a phased approach to implementation, so that where there are additional requirements to make investments, there will be appropriate timescales to ensure that that can be done in a proportionate way. The next slide, please. At the start of the project, we looked at the issues and the emissions that we wanted to consider and think about for the environmental permitting evidence gathering. And this diagram just shows some of the areas that we've been focusing our attention. So looking at not only the day-to-day on-farm management system to prevent prevent the likelihood of pollution incidents, but also the management of the farm, training, etc. We've been looking at animal husbandry, the livestock housing and yard areas, the slurry and manure storage and handling, and also spreading, and also field management, as well as other issues such as raw material usage and storage, so things like energy efficiency and water consumption. Next slide, please. So a reoccurring theme through our engagement with the industry group and that comes up in our discussions is the importance of considering the farm as a whole. This slide shows the nutrient loop and really just indicates that, you know, when we're thinking about ammonia emissions, we need to think about the whole nutrient cycle, and any losses from that cycle are potential losses to the environment, either to air or to water, and therefore, you know, thinking about this in a whole farm approach will ensure that we're maximising the opportunities for reducing ammonia emissions. So, you know, if a farmer is covering their slurry store, and you know, it makes sense to think about how that slurry and manure is then applied to land. And similarly, it's important to think about, when thinking about housing, reducing ammonia emissions from housing, you know, to think about that in the round, and think about cross-media effects of one particular technique over the other. Next slide. So the nutrition and genetics groups have been looking at genetic techniques to reduce emissions, as well as nutrition opportunities, and that focus has been co-located around 3 headings: herd management, feed management, and environmental management. And the next slide, please, shows that in a little bit more detail. And so with herd management, you know, it's around improving health and welfare to help improve and maintain productivity levels, which helps to enable the need to keep fewer animals, fewer replacements on farm, but whilst maintaining the productivity. And there are other measures within that, particularly for beef, such as regularly weighing cattle and monitoring animals to ensure that you know, that the herd health plan is working. We've also been looking at the genetics, and Promar have done some work for us identifying the opportunities around breeding for feed efficiency, and so, you know, that's also been playing into the evidence collation. We've also been looking at feed management. So Kate already mentioned that a key technique for reducing ammonia emissions particularly is to reduce the protein content of the diet to match the animal's requirements. And with grazing livestock, the opportunities for that are, you know, depend on the grazing times the animal is spent out in the fields, but also whether they're housed or not, and whether they've got access to other types of rations. So we've been talking a lot about the applicability of these techniques within the group and how they could apply to farm situations. We've also been looking at balancing the protein, balancing the energy levels in the diet with the protein to help improve nitrogen utilization efficiency, looking at silage analysis, and also looking at other monitoring techniques such as milk urea, nitrogen levels, and to help inform that feedback mechanism to help inform the right choices with the diets. We've also been looking at other more novel techniques, and we've also, the scope of this work has been looking at cross-media impacts. So we've had a focus on greenhouse gas emissions as well. So so you'll see there in the slide, the use of methane inhibitors to reduce greenhouse gas emissions such as 3-NOP, and that's shown as an orange square because that's not yet commercially available, but something on the horizon. Also within feed management and thinking more around grazing, it's about improving forage quality, the types of grasses, and also nutrient management planning. I'll move on to the next slide. The housing, slurry and spreading group have been looking similarly at the opportunities for housed animals. So and the focus of that group when we've been looking at the applicability of some of these techniques is what can be done retrospectively on existing farms, and what options and what techniques are really mainly only available due to the high investment costs to new buildings or new farms. And we've been looking at, as I've said, housing and yard areas, slurry storage and treatment, fields, so spreading, and also environmental management. So the next slide shows some examples of what we've been looking at, and it really reflects some of the key themes that we've already touched on earlier in Kate's presentation. But with the housing, slurry ammonia emissions are largely affected by the flooring design and management, and for new housing there are low emission flooring techniques that are available that can help to reduce emissions, and then for existing farms, the focus is more on how the housing system is managed, so regular scraping and washing, and techniques such as reducing emitting surfaces. But in all of this we have to think about potential cross-media implications, thinking about not compromising any health or welfare requirements that the animals need, and also need to be flexible because we recognise through the feedback and the work that we've been doing with the industry group just the sheer diversity of housing types and production systems that are employed within the dairy sector in the country. We've also been looking at manure and slurry storage, which touches on the other policy proposals such as slurry covers, low emission spreading, and rapid incorporation of manures when they're applied to fields. But we've also been exploring some of the other techniques such as slurry separation, and as Kate mentioned, techniques that are quite commonly used in livestock buildings in Northern Europe, such as slurry acidification systems as well. We've also been looking at spreading equipment and calibration of the equipment, as well as the actual low emission spreading techniques. And again, going back to the nutrient loop diagram, thinking about the whole farm approach, so thinking about the environment management system as well. Next slide, please. So as a group, we've been collating the evidence and discussing that and thinking about the applicability of those techniques. We've been looking at identifying techniques for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and we're currently commissioning a piece of work to link that all in with general water quality and diffuse pollution as well, so focusing on things like resource efficiency. And we recognise that there are already regulations in place, and the aim isn't to duplicate those, but to draw on those and draw on existing codes of conduct and best practice that is already there. So this is a process of collating the available evidence on what the opportunities are for primarily reducing ammonia emissions and greenhouse gas emissions, but also thinking about that in an integrated way. Looking forward, we will be continuing to work very closely with the technical working group and collating the feedback from the working group members. We'll be continuing our evaluation of the techniques that we have already identified and any gaps in applicability and costs. We're also conscious that there are lots of techniques in development and on the horizon that that we see in the farming press on a weekly basis at the moment, focusing on ammonia emissions and greenhouse gas emissions. So we're doing that horizon scanning as well. We want to make sure that any conclusions that we draw from this evidence and recommendations that we draw from this evidence gathering is properly costed. So we're looking at case studies and real life application on farms in England, and we'll be then pulling that all together to summarize this into a single recommendation to help inform the policy development when DEF recommends that process. Additionally, it's hard to embark on this project without thinking about what the policy might look like. And so working with the group, there's been lots of questions about the applicability of the policy, the types of farms that might need to require permitting and how the permitting approach might be applied depending on the size of the farm. And so we've been discussing that, and we've also been commissioning some work around permitting approaches, not only looking at how other countries permit the dairy and beef sectors, but also looking at options for potential options for introducing permitting and what those metrics might be, such as will it be based on the farm size, would it be based on the farm type, or a combination of those, or the level of productivity, or production, etc. And there are questions around defining intensive that we've been exploring as well. So we've been discussing that with the technical working group. We had a workshop a couple of weeks ago now, just to draw together everybody's views on that, and that'll be an ongoing discussion to help inform the policy development later in the year. And we've also been talking to the industry group about other proposals and other approaches as alternatives to permitting, and the group have been exploring the idea of a toolbox approach, and I'm sure Peter might want to, or John may want to touch on that, but that's all I was going to say. So over to you, Peter.
Thanks, Kate. Thanks, Tom. That's given us a really good overview of what we're currently looking at. I'd like to now bring in Tim Downs and John Allen. Tim Downs is an organic dairy farmer from Shropshire and is also part of AHDB's Strategic Farm Programme. And I'm imagining that the audience today, John Allen probably needs little introduction as part of Kite Consulting, advising many dairy farms, food processors across the sector as well. So Tim, just to bring you in quickly, we've heard from Kate and Tom that some quite big changes coming to farming. From a farmer's perspective, how do you see this as on the level of challenge that we're currently facing?
It's a huge challenge, Peter. Thank you. Certainly from Shropshire, we are one of AHDB's strategic dairy farms, so we're tackling this head on with the help of others. We've had a farm walk just 2 days ago to look at becoming more lean and mean, and look at all the different options for our farming system out there. So we're very lucky we invested in slurry storage, covered a slurry store a number of years ago, and in hindsight that was a wonderful thing to do, with all of these plans coming in the future to cover and reduce ammonia emissions. I certainly think there's a lot that needs to be done. The timescales are quite short. Those certainly do take some consideration, and the costs of these things, we've had experiences with grants before, where you apply for a grant for £5,000, for example, and it ends up costing 25. So we've got to be quite careful that some of these solutions are practical on farm. And you did mention that Tom certainly said the housing and facilities on farms are so disparate. There's so many different varieties, so it takes an awful lot of planning to get all this to work. But it's a wonderful direction we're heading in to try and reduce pollution and enable a much cleaner, greener environment to produce the food we so desperately need.
And John, going on from that, the impact of the wider industry and the ability of farms to make those investments from the returns that we're getting from products currently, do we need to, how are farms going to cope with this and building those business plans to be able to make this sort of thing happen?
Hi, thanks very much, and thanks Tim and Kate and Tom. Good to see you. We undertook some of the permitting work project, and I think what we did do as part of that is that we looked at the permitting schemes and the arrangements that are existing in other parts of the world. For instance, we looked at Germany, Holland, Denmark, France, New Zealand, and actually Ireland. So when you look around the world, there are variations, admittedly. For instance, Ireland hasn't currently got any real legislation except for pigs and poultry, so probably similar to ourselves. But in many of the other countries we looked at, then they've got schemes, or they're about to introduce schemes. So they're going through the same phase that we're going through. So this is worldwide. And I suppose that's the consolation I would offer to Tim and other clients, is that this isn't an English issue. I mean, no doubt there might be some questions about the regionalisation of this within the UK, but certainly it's going to be across, I guess, the UK. So that's the first thing, is that everybody's going to be having to up their game in the way we operate. And I guess what that means, that in terms of competitiveness, then, other countries and other places are going to have costs as well as ourselves for investment. And we are doing projects, we're helping others, and we've got various projects with processors looking at what we term the gap, because farmers are going to lose BPS. So that's a form of revenue. And they've also going to have to find money to invest. So there's going to be depreciation. So if you put the loss of BPS and depreciation on investment together, it's quite realistic that some farmers will be facing an additional 3p a litre to their costs, or they're going to have to recover that out of the market in the next 5 to 6 years. So that's a significant amount of money when you think the average profitability is about 2.5 to 3p. So it will challenge a lot of farmers, and we do anticipate that therefore there will be a bigger restructuring of dairy in 23 to 25 as farmers maybe cease production because they anticipate this pressure coming on them, and they don't really want to spend money, especially for a generational change. I think if they've got the generational issue sorted, then with the rising costs and with the fact that these costs are going to come into other places around the world, then those who are going to stay will probably make the investments and make the change. And I think then that gives a relatively positive outlook for them. But it is going to be a matter that farmers are going to have to work out for themselves what they want, which side of the fence they want to be going forward.
Thanks, John. We've had a few questions coming in, and we've got a couple on slow stores and that sort of thing. So, Kate, I guess over to you first. One from Stuart Bacon. One of the big areas of targeting is the covering of slurry stores by 2027, and we've been led to believe there is a sizable slurry investment scheme coming. Could you give more detail on how this money may be made available? We're now only 5 years from covering being a requirement. With 18 months required for planning, the clock is running down without knowing the requirements or the potential funding.
Absolutely. I mean, I absolutely acknowledge that this is a massive issue in view of the time that's available. And I think it's fair to say, is it realistic to expect all existing slurry stores to be covered with, retrofitted with an impermeable cover, and I strongly suspect it isn't realistic, if I'm honest. We're going to consultation, we hope, next year on what the requirements will be. And we have commissioned analysis to look at actually what's really feasible. So we'll be coming out with conclusions on that and seeking views. In terms of the scheme that's likely to be available, we anticipate that there should be some kind of announcement next spring with the co-design work underway at the moment, and then the first round starts in autumn next year. And at that point, I really hope we have managed to be able to consult, and that hopefully we will have a clear direction on what it is that we're asking farmers to do. I mean, I think that would be, at the moment, that seems like the best outcome that we can reach, but I do recognise your concerns. There's actually another question on covering slurry using permeable covers, so straw. That is actually something that we're looking at, because as I say, it's not necessarily realistic to expect impermeable covers immediately. I'll give a hint that our analysis really suggests that it's a very good idea putting them on new stores at the moment. So we'll just have to see where the consultation takes us. There are plenty of issues to do with both impermeable and permeable covers, and we need to take that into consideration because there can be health and safety issues. So we hope to come up with something practical and pragmatic, and of course that the industry can achieve, because we don't want to bounce the industry into a situation where it's really not possible to comply. So we need to take that into consideration.
Thanks, Kate. And Tom, just bringing you in here on the impermeable cover fronts. We've been looking at quite a few different bits and pieces. Give a quick idea on where we are, because we've looked at crusts, straws, floating covers and that sort of thing, haven't we?
Yeah, absolutely. We've been looking at the full spectrum of covers, and that includes, like you say, crusts and the use of straw. I think one of the analyses that we did on straw as a crust was around potential for increasing greenhouse gas emissions as well. So that, when we're thinking about greenhouse cross media impacts, we also need to think around that. But certainly, crusting and using straw to encourage either a crust or as a cover is quite an effective as an ammonia abatement technique.
Yeah, can I just come in there? Because one of the things I think that it is, and Tom has alluded to it, and is that there's a lot of crossovers here. Because the Clean Air Act is about one thing, or I'll let these clarify that, the ammonia. But when you've got the catchment sensitive area legislation as well, we've got to manage nitrogen anyway, and we've got to probably use it more efficiently, and certainly with the price of fertilizer going up, then that makes it more imperative to do that. So there's quite a lot of crossovers. So for instance, covering new stores, maybe acidification, which has some dual benefits because you actually do create ammonium sulfate, which is a really good fertilizer to use, and you actually retain more nitrogen in the slurry. Those can be systems which will benefit for the Clean Air Act, but they'll also be beneficial for the farming and reducing the greenhouse gas emissions. So I think in all the work we've been asked to do, then it's always been said that, can you please look at the other things that are going on as well, so we don't end up going in differing directions and being pulled in different directions. And I think that's a good part of what we're trying to do, is that people are trying to coordinate things, because you can all see the direction of travel, using less nutrients but using them more efficiently, and that's going to be what it's about, and reducing our environmental footprint.
Thanks, John. And Tim, you've already gone down this route of covered stores and that sort of thing. How much benefit did you see on farm from the nitrogen loss reductions?
Certainly, we put it on for various reasons, for excluding water from the slurry lagoon. So that saved an awful lot of fossil fuel in terms of extra loads of just carting water around or pumping water. The other benefit would be it's a better slurry concentration. We're not actually getting any other rainwater to dilute it, so when it goes on, we're putting it on effectively. And it wasn't a huge job to do. We managed to dig out the lagoon and fence it and do all of the health and safety bits at the same time. And yeah, it served the purpose. Whether there's more anaerobic prevention, so it allows the slurry that's stored to stay in a more stable state. We're also adding slurry bugs to it, and not a huge amount has been mentioned about different biology and bacteria in the system. So we're predominantly loose yarded for our milking cows on both farms. So we're adding nutrients to try and tie in some of the nitrogen and ultimately ammonia within the straw yarded bedded systems. So and sheeting those when they go out to field as well to make a product called bokashi, which something may or may not be common knowledge. So it's a Japanese anaerobic fermentation process that locks in 60% of the carbon within the system. Stores more energy, has a much higher energy relation as well. So it's a better product to incorporate into the silage ground or growing grass crops, or ultimately into other cereal crops, if that's your want or requirement. But bugs are a big thing that I think haven't been looked at effectively.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Tim. I want to change tack a little bit here and have a look at buildings, because obviously buildings are one of the big infrastructure costs on any operation. A question in from Rob Hitch. If mandatory standards are introduced from new cattle housing, will older non-compliant buildings ever be prevented from housing cattle? Kate, I guess that probably is going to fall on your lap.
I guess it is. I suppose it is. It does make logical sense, doesn't it? But I mean, I know that the turnover time, the replacement time is incredibly long. I'm sure people have got some agricultural buildings that have been in use for probably nearly 100 years. So how realistic that is, I don't know. And whether maybe retrofitting is something that needs to be considered after some time, I'm not sure. At the moment, we know that housing can be one of the most expensive measures, and we know that the costs are significantly reduced if that can be done when something's renewed, which is why the idea of a mandatory standard came about rather than a retrofit. But I have to say that we're really waiting for the conclusions of Tom's work before we think about this in too much more detail. So I've not got much more to say.
Okay, thanks. And there's quite a few questions coming in on housing and flooring systems. So David Haston, current ammonia impact modelling for the new dairy cow building development still uses standard emission factors which reflect historical types of building design and within building slurry handling systems. What research is being undertaken or funded by DEFRA specifically into the effectiveness of new types of dairy cow housing design which facilitate the rapid and continual removal of slurry from the building, such as that developed at the new National Centre for Dairy Science Innovation at the University of Nottingham on reducing ammonia from dairy cow accommodation. So Tom, I guess over to you there. Yeah,
I mean, certainly the use of emission factors is something that we've been focusing on as part of this work. So we did commission a review of the available data that informs the emission factors that are used for standard emission factors, and as part of the evidence collation, we've also been talking to colleagues in Northern Ireland who've done a review of low emission housing systems and their abatement potential. What we tend to see, which is true for pig and poultry, is that there are lots of across Northern Europe there are verification approaches in place to enable housing systems to be tested and verified following an agreed process to enable site reductions to be accepted by either the environment regulator or the planning authority. But a lot of that information is useful in the sense that they use a control shed against the trial shed, so you can see what the reductions are achievable through through their testing procedures. So we have drawn on a lot of that work to date as well. But there is, as a regulator involved in permitting the pig and poultry sector, we often have to draw on information from a variety of sources to help inform the types of reductions that can be applied when doing an air impact assessment. The data set that supports the UK emission factors is regularly reviewed, and there are ongoing projects which Kate might want to talk about in a bit more detail. But it's interesting that some of the research that we've come across, a report by Vanganen recently looked at a range of low emission flooring systems, and I think they monitored 18 farms over 18 months, I think, and they had very mixed results. I think they could, and I think the conclusions of that study need to be explored, but it really suggested that actually the way in which the housing system is managed, that is the frequency of scraping and wash down, etc., is very, very important, and also so is the diet. So it goes back to that point about thinking of things in the round, and it may be that longer term existing housing flooring systems, if they're managed right, and you've got the right diet, but also you're regularly scraping or cleaning down, then it's just as effective as a potentially low emission flooring system.
Yeah, I'll come in there because I think that's I'll set you up, Peter. because to be fair, you and RABDF did come forward with a sort of toolkit approach, and we've been talking to Tom a bit about it in terms of perhaps moving it on into some form of, I guess, a risk assessment tool that is part of any process going forward in the future. And I think what you were coming forward with, and I'll let you as chair perhaps explain a little bit more, is looking at some of the factors that Tom was alluding to there, because there's a lot of things at play on a farm, and they're not always going to be the buildings, are they? There's going to be quite a lot of other things that you can score for your business as to whether or not you're a high risk, a red, amber or green business, isn't it? Is that fair, Peter, from your point of view?
Yeah, I think so. Thanks, John. Yeah, I mean, what we were looking at really is risk assessing emissions from farm. So looking at lots of 7 or 8 different individual areas, and whether or not a score could be developed. So if we were to look at housing, for instance, the type of flooring will go into the equation, and then the frequency of cleaning of that flooring. So that would give you a risk based on in comparison to a solid floor that would only be cleaned once a day, for instance. So if you had a slatted floor that was scraped twice a day, you'd have a different emission risk from those floorings. But it's having the quality of data to be able to actually provide the information that goes into that risk assessment, so that you can see what the effect is. And we know from the work that Kate's team has done and provided previously in a scenario analysis on different levels of emission from different areas, that we can then weight those results so that we can hopefully give a cost-effective reduction method for each farm, so that they can see the best way of reducing the emission on the farm overall. And that's, I think, the key thing at the end of the day is making sure that farms are spending the money in the most effective way to reduce the emission from farm. And, Kate, I don't know if you want to come in here, because at the end of the day, the most important thing here, I guess, is reducing emissions from farms depending on what their system is. And not every item will be fit to every farm.
Sorry, I'm struggling with my meat. There we go. Yeah, I think that's probably right. I mean, a sort of a menu-based approach is something that we have been fairly keen to do from the beginning. It's actually quite difficult to do that through regulatory approach, and I think we're very interested in what industry approaches could be used if that looks to be a really good way of doing something, and alongside advice and grants and things. That's certainly something we could look at. We're really, obviously, the targets that we've got to reduce emissions are quite substantial, and actually I think what we've seen when we've done analysis is that pretty much most farms have to do pretty much everything they can in order to achieve the targets that we've currently got set out, and I think that's the really difficult bit. So unless new technologies come along, which of course would be fantastic, I think we're potentially in a bit of a challenging position. But certainly, whatever, as I presented earlier on the impacts of ammonia, actually the sooner we can stop those emissions reductions, the better it's going to be in terms of its results, particularly for the environment and ecosystems.
Thanks, Tim.
Going on from that, Kate, have you scored some of the mechanisms to get to your 48 kiloton reduction by 2030? Do you know which ones farmers will need to invest in? And following on from that question, there's quite a lot of grant programs running at the moment, and I'm concerned for myself about amount of bandwidth to apply for all these different mechanisms that you've got to understand fit your farming system and allow you time to implement them, apply for the grant, pay for it up front very often. So if that's 50 or 60,000 for a new lagoon cover on a big farm, and then claim the grant back, are people going to, coming back to John's point, are people going to be able to afford that on current milk returns?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, and I acknowledge that it's possible that not everybody will be able to afford that. Well, I also acknowledge the point you're making about bandwidth. I mean, we've been working very closely with catchment sensitive farming advisors, and we're really pleased that that scheme's expanding. But again, I recognise that probably that support won't be available to everybody. So, you know, it's an issue, and I hope it's an issue that will be picked up in the co-design work that's going on nutrient management. In terms of scoring and trying to reach the 48 kilotons, I have to be completely honest with you that we have not identified a path that can get us to 48 kilotons at the moment. Our central scenario is always falling short based on what we've got, and we've actually got some work underway to see what else is necessary. Of course, the projections might not be right, and we need to make sure that the policy instruments we've got in place, whether they be industry-led or through a regulatory route, are flexible enough to deal with whatever may come in the future, and indeed any restructuring of the industry, just to make sure it's appropriate. But I think that the menu-based approach based on what's suitable for a farm is a really interesting idea.
Yeah, I think also what the rise in fertilizer costs, and it probably isn't going to be transitory. You know, who knows about where they just spike and then they come back, but it's unlikely in reality, isn't it? Because energy costs implicitly are going to increase, and energy is a big component of fertilizer, or even, you know, whichever way you look at it. And so I think farmers, I'd like to hope, Kate, that you will be seeing quite a lot of change. We don't want, by the way, farmers to reduce their fertilizer usage dramatically and make silly decisions, because that will only compromise food production in the UK or even other places next year, for instance. It's a very high risk strategy. But I think over time, then if farmers start to manage it, I had some interesting discussions with a client last week who had all the issues that Tim had. Of you know, carting a lot of water around, and he was very interested in trying to reduce the water in his slurries and manures anyway, and he was very interested in actually getting more recovery of nitrogen and fertilizer and phosphate, in his case, out of the slurries and manures anyway, because you can see the direction of travel with the cost of fertilizer. And Tim, you're an organic farmer, so you're already ahead in that race, aren't you, in that regard?
trying to make best use of our slurry. Certainly, John. I think I might have upset Kate, Peter.
No, it seems like Kate's had to dash off, but there are just a couple of other quick questions which I think we can still probably cover off. I am conscious that we have reached our time, so just a couple of minutes. And one of those really, I guess, would fall mainly on Tom's shoulders anyway, is around new technologies and that sort of thing. But I'll couple it up together with slowly spreading windows and environment, the seasons moving. At the moment, we have a fairly rigid system for slowly spreading windows and that sort of thing. You know, within this program, can we look, or should we be looking at changing the slowly spreading windows to be able to cope with changes in the seasons and changes in growing periods? And how are we going to quickly be able to evaluate the new technologies that might go along with that sort of thing to best benefit the targeted results?
Well, I think it's all really important, and you know, to think about all of this in an integrated way. So, you know, like we've said through the whole project, but also through today's presentation, you can't do one thing and then you know, you need to think about potential unintended consequences. I would have hoped the issue, you know, around spreading windows and thinking around nutrient management in the whole will be picked up by the nutrient management project and the group that Kate, you know, referred to, that's kind of leading that kind of thinking at the moment, and I've no doubt that that is, you know, at the forefront of their minds with all of this. In terms of new technologies, we do need to be agile to what's happening, and there's so much happening at the moment, and we as regulators tend to struggle to keep up, and as you know, policy is slightly slower to develop than the market. So we have been thinking about, certainly about technology verification, so that you know that can provide that certainty to a farmer making a purchase, but also to the technology companies that are developing these techniques, that you know they can market or they can rely on the reductions that are being presented by the technology company. So there's a huge advantage both to enabling an innovation within the the technology industry, the agriculture technology industry, but also there's huge benefit then to the farmers and the consumers using those techniques to be assured that actually it's going to do what it says on the tin. So we have been looking at verification of technologies. It's something that comes up frequently through the pig and poultry planning process, but also through the permitting process as well. And you know, and other countries, you know, certainly likes of Denmark and Germany, etc., have, you know, as I mentioned, gone through have got verification procedures in place, which we're looking at quite closely, you know, to see if there is any value in adopting something appropriate. But as regulators, I think we have to have that open-minded, you know, be open-minded to the evidence that can be presented, not only guide the innovation companies in terms of what the evidence needs are, but also be open-minded to you know, having that to the evidence that is presented in whatever form. But it's certainly a need that we've identified across with the other environmental regulators like DAERA and SEPA and Natural Resources Wales as something that we need to look at.
Thanks. And I'm going to wrap this up quickly, I promise. But John, one for you quickly. Data is clearly key. Quality data and analysis is clearly key. What can the industry do to help make that easier for Tom in being able to look at these new techniques? And do you think we are making sufficient progress developing the measures and the practical measurement to enable a premium in environmental standards to be evidenced for market benefits? That's in from Chris Boucher.
Yeah, I knew Chris had asked that. I was hoping you weren't going to ask me. Honestly, I personally, I think unfortunately it's a license to operate, and maybe you get points of difference around UK produce and hopefully that might stand for something, who knows, in trade negotiations, but I doubt it, if I'm honest. But I think other places are going to end up doing the same things. On the data, I do think, and it's slow, and everybody has dreams that you can have big CMS data sets that feed into other data sets that feed into other data sets, and that farmers don't have to constantly enter new information repeatedly in different places. And I think that's always a dream. But I think, to be fair, we're starting to see the evidence of certain companies who can, and taking Tom's point, who can do the APDI technology. I sound like I know something. I know nothing, but I do know people who do, and they tell me that you've got this technology now that can feed data between data systems. And I think that would be something to be done, because taking, for instance, some of the information that we're talking about in being uploaded, a lot of this data would be, for instance, uploaded into an ARLA 360 compliance audit or a Muller Advantage audit. So why would you enter the data twice? Why not do it? I just picked on those two, by the way. There are others that are available, but I think that is a future, and that way then the data does get verified, because the more and more data goes into different places, the more and more it has to be verified and be accurate, as we know from some of the assurance schemes that are currently in place where data isn't always accurate. Yeah. Okay.
Thanks, John. Well, thank you very much, everybody. It's been a great session, and there's plenty more questions that I'm sure could have been asked. And certainly, we've been discussing with Kate and Tom before the session about the requirements for all the different consultations to make sure that we have a compatible system that works long term for the industry, and that we can get a clear understanding of how we need to be moving forwards, bearing in mind the fairly short time scale that this is all looking at. But there's lots of work to be done, and there'll be lots more information coming through shortly. So hopefully everybody's been able to pick some information up today that will be useful, and we'll continue this discussion at a further time. If everybody is able to come to Dairy Tech next year, that would be great. It'd be great to see everybody in person again, and hopefully that will all continue as expected. Thank you again to our sponsors, to Barclays and to 4Farmers for their help in putting this on. And thank you to everybody that's joined us over the last few days in listening to the sessions, and also to those that have taken part. We couldn't do it without you. So thank you very much. And I wish you all a Merry Christmas, I guess, is the next big event. Thank you very much.
Bye.